In 1866, in the Choctaw Nation, the treaty was signed in nearby Fort Smith, Arkansas. Signing that treaty changed the trajectory of the people who had once been enslaved. They were now able to begin their lives freely with their families, establish businesses, and at some point in time, hopefully be allowed to get education for their children and to worship freely in the churches of their choice. Such was the situation of the Blackwater family, a family from Scullyville County in the Choctaw Nation. They were a family of freedmen. The names of the family members are found on enrollment cards. Annie Blackwater, who was 55 years of age, her name and that of two of her grandchildren can be found on card number 709. She appeared in front of the Dawes Commission in June of 1899. She lived in the Scullyville County area in the community, a small country hamlet known as Brazil. She was enrolled on the card along with two of her grandchildren, Willie and Simon Colton, as it's written, but it would later be recorded as Cotton. She was married, actually, to Thomas Blackwater. He's not on the same card with her because his card had been questioned because at one point he was enrolled or placed on a card of Chickasaw freedmen, but placed on a doubtful card. And he remained there until 1902, when later he was placed on an official Dawes card. His name is found on card number 1469, and one can see that he appeared in front of the commission in December of 1902. There's a lot more information about him, and there would be questions asked. Was he Choctaw? Was he Chickasaw? Did he come with Choctaws? Was the family really a Chickasaw family? And this is what held up his status. But he was also on an earlier roll in 1896 of Choctaw freedmen, where eventually he would be placed. Looking again at Annie's card, we learn from the back of the card the name of her parents, Jerry and Nancy Carney. They had had that name as they had once been enslaved by a Choctaw Indian whose name was Carney. We also see the name of Rebecca Colton. We're not quite sure who she is initially, but she was the mother of the two children whose names were on the card with her. Her husband, Frank Colton, was not a citizen, and thus his name did not appear on any card at all. Husband, Thomas Blackwater, who's on card number 1469. We know, of course, a little bit more about him just by looking at the card, because in the middle, it indicates that he had enrolled in the 113th, as it says, the Kansas Regiment in May of 1864, and he was discharged in April of 1866 at Devall's Bluff, and then returned to Indian Territory. On the back of Thomas Blackwater's card, it is learned that his father's name was Giles Jackson and his mother was Lucy Jackson, but neither one of them were citizens of the Choctaw Nation. So the question does emerge, how then was citizenship granted? Of course, he had, at the time of the Civil War, had been enrolled or had been enslaved as a person in the Choctaw Nation. And Doran Watkin, who was Choctaw, was the slaveholder. We learned, though, also from the card and the file of Thomas Blackwater a few extra details that perhaps led to a little bit of confusion initially about him. He was asked, of course, the basic questions, what is your name and your age? And we know he was quite old. He was in his 70s at the time of the commission. Who was your father? He says, Giles. And Giles was born in Virginia. And his mother was Lucy, both of whom were deceased. And they were deceased when he was a small child. So he was totally raised in the territory. But what's also very, very interesting, it's indicated very early that the family came from Mississippi with Chickasaws. Again, clearly, a family in Virginia was sold south into Mississippi and then ended up coming on the removal with Chickasaws to Indian Territory. More information is there. They asked him where he was living at the end of the war. He mentions White River. Well, what were you doing there? He points out he was in the military. He was in the Army. They asked, the Federal Army? Yes, sir, he replied. He enlisted nearby Fort Smith. Where were you discharged? At Duval's Bluff. Of course, that explains why he makes a reference to being near the White River. Do you have discharge papers? Well, I have it at home, but I took it to Spiro and showed it to the commissioners. Are you married? And do you have children? Yes, sir, he replied. And when asked their names, he replies Willie and Simon Cotton, who were his grandchildren. We do know that it is confirmed that Thomas Blackwater was indeed a Civil War soldier. He was, as we can see, a part of Company F of the 113th United States Colored Infantry, the New Infantry. We also see that he was born in Virginia, to be specific, in Clark County, Virginia. It's not known how he and his parents were transported from Virginia into later Mississippi and ended up coming west. But it is confirmed that he, like his parents, was also taken and arrived in the 1830s in Indian Territory. During his military period, he was originally a part of Company A of the United States Colored Infantry, the 11th Colored Infantry. But by the time he mustered out, he was part of the 113th New U.S. Colored Infantry. That's simply because the 11th and the old 112th merged, and they formed the new 113th United States Colored Troops. Looking again at the card of Annie Blackwater, we see that the mother of the children, the Colton children, was a woman called Rebecca Colton. Her husband was Frank, and he was the father of the two children. But again, it's not quite sure who was Rebecca. Well, we do learn that. When we look in the file that accompanies the enrollment packet for Annie Blackwater, we see the standard questions that were asked of her, just as they were of Thomas. And she was about 55 years of age, 20 years younger than her husband, and she had once been enslaved by Green McCurtain, and this is in Mississippi, who was a very prominent man in the Choctaw Nation. They ask her about her husband and if there are two children or if there are any children at home. And she points out that yes, there were. And the names, Willie and Simon, and this time it is typed Cotton. And then it's asked, who is their mother? My daughter, Rebecca. She is dead. Now we know why the Cotton children are on the card with Annie Blackwater. Their mother, Rebecca, had died. We don't know when. We don't know what maybe caused her death, but they were all living with the Blackwaters. It's quite possible that Frank, her husband, could have still been living with the children. That we're not certain. But now we know who Rebecca is. The file of Annie also contained a statement made by Thomas Blackwater, who actually was present with his wife at the commission 3 years earlier. They asked him questions and asked him to whom he belonged. And he points out again Doran Watkins. They wanted to know if he was Choctaw, Chickasaw. He said, well, he was a white man, but his family, they were all Chickasaws. And again, they ask him the same questions. Where were you freed? And he points out that he was in the army. He was finally, of course, released at Duval's Bluff when he was mustered out of service and came right back here to Scullyville County. And I've been here ever since. When, of course, they asked him, when did you get back? After I was mustered out, I didn't tarry at all. I came right here. I made one crop down here on the river at Nick Bowers. I just remember whether it was 1865 or not. Anyhow, I was mustered out and came right on back and made a crop. They were curious. Ran away, did you? Yes, sir, I acknowledge that. Where did you live when you went into the army? On Boggy in the Nation. I joined the army at Fort Smith. Were you a slave, were you? Yes, sir. And then run off and join the army? Yes, sir. They then read something from his discharge, and it says he enlisted in May of 1864 and was discharged on April 9th, 1866. We can see later as they put all the data together. He mentions also another woman in the household. I want to register Rose Wilson. She's living with me. Who was her master? The widow Blackburn. What was she, Choctaw or Chickasaw? And it says she was Choctaw. Finally, it was decided, enrolled Annie Blackwater, 2 children, and Rose Wilson as Choctaw freedmen. Thomas Blackwater was enrolled on a white card as a Chickasaw freedman. Of course, we know later he was placed on a Choctaw freedman roll as well. But there's a little bit more that can be learned. In the book, Black Indians and Freedmen by Christina Dickerson Cousin, it's learned that the AME Church was very, very active after the Civil War in Indian Territory. As it turns out, the Blackwaters lived in a thriving community of Choctaw freedmen, and they became a part of the first congregation of the AME Church in Indian Territory in the Scullyville district. We also know how much education meant to them. In addition to wanting to be able to worship freely in the church of their choice, they wanted their children educated. And in 1889, we see 2 of Thomas and Annie's children listed on a school record from Brazil Neighborhood School in 1889. We see a Nellie Blackwater. We also see at the bottom the name of Rebecca. Rebecca, of course, would later marry years later, and her 2 children, the Cotton or Colton children, would be enlisted after she had long passed away. The names of the Blackwaters are found in this index to the final rolls of citizens and freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes. We see near the bottom the name of many in the Blackwater family. We see Annie, but we also see their children who are listed. And of course, we see also Thomas's name as well. As far as the Cotton children are concerned, we see also on the same index the names of Willie and Simon, and they officially went on the roll, not as Colton, but as Cotton, and their respective roll numbers. The freedmen from Scullyville as well as the freedmen throughout the Choctaw Nation, began to create new lives for themselves. Schools were established, neighborhood schools, and even boarding schools were established in the Choctaw Nation. And the Blackwaters emerged as part of that Scullyville community. And they began to emerge among people who were able to start to create businesses and pursue occupations and to marry those whom they had chosen as spouses. And of course, their children thrived, as did many of the children in the Choctaw freedmen neighborhoods, from Scullyville to the south, to Tom in the southeast, all the way to Atoka and many, many, many other communities throughout the Choctaw Nation. Theirs is a rich legacy, a legacy that continues. This has been the Blackwater family story, part of a series of Oklahoma freedmen remembered. This video has been endorsed by the Choctaw Chickasaw Freedmen Association. Thank you for watching.